Key verse, Genesis 21:17, CSB. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What's wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the boy crying from the place where he is." Major moment. God is committed to having his family back together and chose one family to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. Our God calls his people. In today's scriptures, we see Abram was no exception. Some of us may know his story well, how he followed God, Hebrews 11:8. How God gave him the new name Abraham, Genesis 17:4-5. How he and his wife Sarah finally received a long-awaited son, Hebrews 11:11. How his descendants became as many as the stars of the sky, Genesis 22:17. Hebrews 11:12. But we often forget this very calling led Abraham into a form of exile. He had to leave his hometown to wander all his life in a land not his own, Genesis 12:1. Throughout this exile experience, Abraham believed all of God's promises, yet only some were fulfilled during his lifetime. Others were fulfilled as God worked out his purposes over many generations. For instance, Abraham believed all families of the earth would be blessed through him, Genesis 12:3. Yet he did not see the full realization of that promise, which was ultimately fulfilled through Jesus some 2,000 years later, Hebrews 11:13, Galatians 3:14. Still, God called Abraham, and because he followed, he knew God's presence as he waited for God's promises, and Abraham's exilic life also intersected with others. Hagar was from Egypt, Genesis 16:1, but she lived far from her homeland as a servant to Abraham's family in a country not her own. But eventually this caused conflict in Abraham's home, and Hagar fled into the wilderness, Genesis 16:3-6, another exile. Yet God found her out in the desert and offered her both calling and promise. God's words to Hagar remind us of what he told Abraham, yet God's plans for Hagar were also personal and unique to her. God called Hagar to go back, Genesis 16:9, rather than to go, like Abraham in Genesis 12:1. God also told her to name her son Ishmael, which means God hears, Genesis 16:11. The Lord's presence with Hagar in her trouble and exile would come to mind each time she spoke her son's name in years to come. Although they experienced a hard path through the wilderness, Genesis 21:15-16, God provided Hagar and her son with freedom, protected them, and enabled them to build lives on their own. As with Abraham, God made some promises he fulfilled in their lifetimes, Genesis 16:11-12, and some he fulfilled over many generations, Genesis 16:10. While they were not the family through whom Jesus would come, Hagar's descendants would have the opportunity to be blessed by him. God called Hagar, and because she followed, she knew God's presence as she waited for God's promises. And God still calls his people today. Through faith in Jesus Christ, we receive both calling and promise, Matthew 16:24-25, John 8:12, Timothy 1:9, 2 Corinthians 1:20. Our Savior still says, "Follow me." He knows the purposes he has for us, and he calls us to walk by faith, depending on him even when the path is unknown, submitting to him even when the path is hard. And forever his promise in our exile is, "I am with you," Matthew 28:20 CSB. We can know God's presence as we walk in his calling and wait for his promise.